I believe that Saskatchewan can find the right path. I believe we can carefully and cautiously begin to reopen our province while still protecting Saskatchewan residents from the spread of COVID-19.
Saskatchewan was the first to unveil a detailed plan for a gradual reopening of its economy, but it's certainly not the only province moving in that direction. What does this tell us about how the provinces themselves are managing this crisis? Is there a need for some sort of national coordination? It's Thursday, and I'm here with At Issue. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj is in Ottawa tonight. It's no joke that this is the only way we do know it's Thursday, for real. Many people agree with me on Twitter. Okay, so the first example is Saskatchewan, but certainly we're hearing rumblings out of British Columbia, even Quebec, talking about returning to school. What do we make of these plans? Not in the specific way, but the kind of way that they plan to unfold and the federal role that might be part of that. I'll start with you, Chantal.
It's totally normal that provinces will be moving at a different pace because the pandemic is hit in different ways in all of those provinces. In this province where I live, the hardest hit so far, there is a huge difference between the Montreal area in the large sense of the word and the rest of the province of Quebec. So the expectation is that there will be liberalization outside of the larger Montreal area long before it happens in the city. I think that's totally normal, and I sense that if there's a federal role in there, it may be in agreeing with the provinces on a set of standards that allow you to say go. But otherwise, provinces do have control over their school system, which is key to reopening the economy, for sure. And they will be going at their own pace.
And Andrew, what would that federal role be like if it's not their jurisdiction, but certainly they are playing the role of coordinator in the midst of all this?
Well, there's going to have to be some pretty close coordination because people move around. I mean, unless we're going to continue to maintain interprovincial controls, and maybe that's part of the mix, but otherwise, if a province liberalizes and finds that it gets another outbreak, some of those people may wind up infecting people in other provinces. So it's not quite a simple matter as letting every province go at its own speed. Secondly, the whole thing strikes me as a little bit premature. I grant that the Saskatchewan model is gradual and it does a little bit at a time depending upon how much close contact with the public a business has, et cetera. But unless you accompany it with much higher levels of testing so that basically you can pounce on every individual case as it shows up, go after the contacts, isolate them if you have to, all of the measures that public health advocates advise, then even if you're going gradually, you're not necessarily in safe territory. Mm-hmm. So we need a much larger national effort at testing, and I think the feds could contribute to that as well. It would be better, it seems to me. You can allow for different speeds in different provinces, but it does have to be coordinated, I think.
And Althea, how much of that will provinces be receptive to? I know there's another call on Friday between the Prime Minister and Premiers.
Well, I assume that it's already kind of been decided because the two things that Andrew and Chantal just suggested are things that federal officials have already said that they are doing. So today there was an announcement about ramping up testing nationally. There was an announcement about just the set of standards that Chantal was talking about like this is the checklist that we would like to ensure that you can scratch off before you open up local economies. And I think the point about regional differences is a really good one. I mean, Calgary is experiencing a very different caseload than Edmonton, for example. And so what does that mean, not just for interprovincial travel, but within the provinces themselves? Mm-hmm. And so is there a larger role for provinces to play in terms of really demanding that anybody who's crisscrossing self-isolate for another quarantine period? What does that mean for people and how they move? The other thing I think that will be really important is that there is a very clear message coming from the provinces and municipalities as to what is allowed and what is not allowed. Because if you have very stark differences between jurisdictions, like today, one thing that struck me from Premier Mo's communication was, it seems like it's going to be okay to have a barbecue with some of your friends in your backyard. Well, is it? Is it? And so I think at there will need to be like, this is what you're allowed to do here, but this,
Yeah.
if you move from here and you go over there,
Yeah.
you can't do this anymore.
Yeah, and that's going to be hard
it's
for
clear
sure.
that and we don't know enough about the virus. And I think that's something else that federal officials have really stressed. We don't know how long immunity lasts. There's a ton of stuff that we don't know. And so the government is investing in more money to try to figure out all the stuff we don't know.
Let me talk
But
about
there-
go ahead, Chantal. Yep.
But there is one thing we do know, and it is that the current status quo is untenable for a year or 2 years. So places will open up. There will be trial and errors. In places like Quebec and Toronto, no one's going to be hitting the beaches in PEI. If PEI opens up, it's not even clear that people in Montreal will be able to go to the Laurentians anytime soon.
Yeah.
So there will be errors, but I think it has to be tried.
I hadn't thought about the complications inside a province itself. I want to hit on the other topic I think that is an important one, and that is the Premier's calling in the need for military assistance in long-term care homes in Quebec and Ontario. The Prime Minister, I won't play the clip, but the Prime Minister today said, this is unacceptable, this shouldn't be happening, soldiers shouldn't be looking after seniors. Obviously, it's not the fault, I don't think, of any one provincial government. This would have happened over a period of time. But how should we view this, Andrew, in terms of provincial leadership, the fact that we are at this point now in the two biggest provinces?
It's a scandal. I agree with you that it's a scandal that governments own collectively and all parties own. It is easy, obviously, also to say in hindsight, but it is certainly revealing conditions in some of these long-term care homes, leave aside the pandemic, that in some cases were a scandal. And certainly they seem not to have been nearly prepared. Governments have been playing catch-up, federal and provincial, all the way through this. We've seen this at the federal level in terms of not closing the borders when they might have, of being all over the map on the question of masks, et cetera. So while obviously we're focused right now on trying to save lives and get through this crisis, there will need to be a stock taking after this, not necessarily to point fingers, but to find out where we were deficient at the federal level in terms of their preparedness, and in this particular case, the provinces with their management of the group homes.
Althea, on the same topic.
Well, I think that if you had the same type of public monitoring and shaming that you have for, Toronto restaurants, for example, of nursing homes, there would have been something done much sooner. But sadly, the fact is most of the people who end up in long-term homes are people who cannot speak up for themselves. And the cases that we've seen erupt in the news media about neglect before this even happened, the coronavirus happened, were instances of family members speaking out on behalf of loved ones or workers, many times who are in precarious situations themselves, new immigrants who depend on these low-wage jobs, who have actually sounded the alarm. We heard Patty Hajdu, the Minister of Health, say that there will be a stock-taking nationally about what to do with regards to long-term care homes. But I think this is one of numerous examples that I think have come to the forefront because of COVID-19 to kind of make us realize about some of the gaps in our system, whether it's, really low welfare payments or the situation in long-term care homes, local manufacturing, the safety of the food supply, so many different things have come to the forefront because of this. And this is sadly one very stark example.
Chantal.
Let me take you out of this pandemic. We've just realized all of this. To take you back, I've been covering politics maybe for too long. Was it 2004, Paul Martin and the healthcare accord that was supposed to fix the healthcare system for a generation or forever, and the home care chapter of it? Because we would not have systemized parking older Canadians in homes if we had developed a home care system as part of our Medicare system. And the fact is that despite all those words that you'll find in that agreement that everyone signed on to, we have not. So before we fix let's make sure that all those homes are well maintained in the future, possibly a step back to say, if we offered more home care, we would have less elderly people in homes.
Today, all Canadians are Nova Scotian. We share their grief, we are mourning their loss, and we will be there for them in the difficult days, weeks, and months ahead.
That was the Prime Minister earlier this week giving his condolences to Nova Scotia after a gunman killed 22 people. It was the worst mass shooting this country has seen, and it happened, of course, during a global crisis, a pandemic. And the federal government has had to respond to so many tragedies and crises since the start of 2020. Flight 752, blockades, on and on it goes. And it does make me wonder how challenging, first of all, it is to be a government, but also what it does to a government, how it changes things, maybe even in the long term. Certainly, Chantal, it has changed their own agenda that they just simply don't have any time for. But how does it functionally change a prime minister, a government? Have you given that any sort of thought?
I have. I don't think that I can find some relevant past experience that would say this is what happens. For sure, it's been 6 months. Think of it, 6 months since the last federal election. And ever since basically the end of December, this government has gone from crisis to crisis. None of those crises on the radar at the time of the election. I think possibly the government is thankful that it's no longer a rookie government. That would be really hard for a rookie government to be living through. But I also wonder whether you're not packing in a decade of energy spent over a very short time, and whether at some point, when you think about the future, it might shorten the lifespan in politics of some of the main players, as in I gave and enough is enough.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point I hadn't thought about. Not even just from like a burnout perspective, but I did all this work for this amount of time and I can't keep going like this, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing revealed once again in this crisis, in some of the slowness of the federal response, that there's, from all accounts, they're again trying to run so much through the Prime Minister's office. And you just run into inevitable bottlenecks of time and energy and you know, lagging spirit if you're up to basically round the clock working on these crises. There's an old line, of course, in the military that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. We measure governments often by how well they scramble in response to unforeseen events. So they have their agenda to start with, and so much of it, you know, we've seen from government after government has to be put aside in response to these kinds of events that you couldn't foresee or should have foreseen or what have you. It's not all bad for them. We're seeing that they've now opened up a 13-point lead over the Conservatives in the last Leger poll. That's not just because of a rally around the flag effect. It's also the government is positioned to help people. And, you know, just not long ago, people like me were slagging them off for spending too much money and running too much into deficit. Now people are basically begging them to spend as much as they have to.
Sure.
And that opens up opportunities for them, frankly. They can actually, you know, get a lot of things done in the course of trying to deal with this crisis. If you're basically got carte blanche to spend as much as you like, a lot of other stuff can get spent as well.
It does. I mean, it does seem as though this government, this country, let's be honest, is being particularly tested in these past 6 months. I mean, when we saw the tragedy in Nova Scotia, it was sort of unbelievable that there would be another thing that would be placed on people, and to that end, on the government, and in terms of how they respond. Althea, sorry.
Yeah, there's been a lot of sadness this year. I think from the political standpoint, while it's true that there may be some political careers that are shortened because of this and the stress, I think the lifespan of the government might actually increase. I think there is going to be very little appetite from the Bloc Québécois and the NDP to support any sort of motion of non-confidence or try to defeat any supply bills because of that. And so the government has a much longer leash than it would have had you know, just in December. Some of the horrors of the past few weeks and months will allow the government to move forward on some parts of its agenda, gun control, for example, with what happened in Nova Scotia. But I think mostly this is just a government that is now in kind of survival mode, but that has, I think, and we've seen this from the Prime Minister, a renewed sense of purpose. I think what's been odd is that he is still working from home, he being the Prime Minister, of course, and there's a sense that he kind of looks disconnected and Chrystia Freeland is running the government. I think that there's probably going to be changes in the sort of the visuals that we see going forward. But clearly the public is asking for help from this government. And one thing that Justin Trudeau does very well is that empathetic card. And so the Liberals just need to make sure that the policy pieces fall into place.
Yeah, lots of interesting points there. Probably, to me, the most interesting that the government might last longer. Maybe I'll just get Chantal and Andrew to weigh in on that, because I think that's an interesting observation. I don't know.
The first question you would have to ask yourself is, will the government want to last longer? I agree with Andrew that they've built a serious lead, and they could probably build a rationale for asking for a fresh mandate. I also would not put money in the bank that the Bloc Québécois will necessarily want to play along for whatever in an open-ended manner, be it only because the Bloc is also going up along with the Liberals and is in a good position if there was an election. So if I were the Conservatives, unless their fortunes improve, I would be really careful not to play with fire.
Yeah. Andrew, on
There
that.
will be Yeah, there will have to be a big debate, though, at some point before too long, after we have some hope of winning the war, of winning the peace, that what is going to be the shape of government after the immediate crisis recedes. The sort of conventional wisdom has been, well, they put a lot of emergency programs in place, run up a lot of debt, but after this is over, they'll ramp the spending back down again. The deficit will return to something closer to zero. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think once these programs get put in place, it's going to be very hard to get people off them, get businesses off them. And it may be that it suits the government not to try. So they'll dare the Conservatives to be the baddies who want to try and cut the spending that they've ramped up. So there'll be a big debate, I think, at some point about the size and shape of government. That's wholly appropriate. And maybe that's the next election will have something to do with that.
Okay, lots of smart thoughts there. Thank you all from reporting in from home. Appreciate it.